Alright guys, welcome to 4.3, looking at animal systems. Okay, so this video is going to focus mainly on the first one, which is the digestive system, and then the next video will look at the endocrine and the excretory. Let's jump into it, okay? Alright, so primarily animal systems, we're looking actually at only 3 of the many different systems that are in animals. The first one, the digestive system, which is responsible for the breakdown and absorption of nutrients. The second one is the endocrine system. Not many people know this one very well, but it's the production of hormones and the regulation of the body through chemical messengers. And then the last one is the excretory system, which is the removal of waste products in the body. Okay, so remember, for this video, we're only looking at the digestive system. Okay, so animals, including humans, cannot make their own food, and so we are considered as what we call heterotrophs, okay? So in the previous video, you looked at the term autotroph, meaning self-nourishment. Well, heterotroph, hetero meaning other, trophic meaning nourishment, so other nourishment, so getting our nourishment from other things. So they must consume other organisms in order to obtain the organic molecules that we require to survive, okay? So the function of the digestive system is to basically break down the food and absorb nutrients for the cells to then use. Simply because the cells are too small and the food that we eat are too big, and we need to break them down into very, very small and easily usable molecules, okay? So digestive system has 4 main steps. Number 1, ingestion, which is eating; digestion, which is breaking down; absorption, which is take up; and then egestion, which is pooping. So there are 2 kind of components of the digestive system, containing many, many different organs each. But you have the gastrointestinal tract, which are all of the organs directly involved in the passageway for food, or the main passageway, right? So the gastrointestinal tract will contain the mouth, which is what the food goes into; the esophagus, the stomach, the small, large intestines, and the rectum and the anus. So that's the pathway of the food, basically. Now, on top of that, there are also what we call accessory organs, and these organs are going to assist in the process of digestion by secreting enzymes and other substances, like, for example, the tongue, the salivary gland, the pancreas, the liver, the gallbladder, and things like the appendix. Okay, so there's the diagram of it. You can see there that is all of the organs, both gastrointestinal and some of them accessory, involved in the process. Okay, now one thing to understand about digestion is to understand how digestion works. Okay, there are basically 2 methods of digestion. You have what we call physical or mechanical digestion, which is what is physically grinding and breaking down the food into smaller pieces, for example, through your teeth, right? And that chewing action from the teeth and the bile produced by the liver to break down the fats, that's all what we call physical digestion, where you're physically breaking it down, right? Funny enough, it's actually not the main form of digestion that your body uses. It's actually just to kind of get it started. But actually the main form is actually what we call chemical digestion, the breakdown of complex molecules into simple ones using enzymes, right? And so actually the function of enzymes are really crucial to digestion, because enzymes digest and they break down small particles and proteins and things like that. Okay, so mechanical digestion actually simply just breaks it down, increased surface area, so that the enzymes can then take better action. Okay, enzymes are proteins, and so they act as a biological catalyst. A catalyst is something that speeds up a chemical reaction, and so it speeds up the chemical breakdown of food, and so they play a very important role. And they kind of have this kind of basic function, right? Where what you get is the enzyme, this little protein thing here. It's going to bind to a substrate, which is a sort of any sort of molecule, right? So there's your substrate in green. And then when it binds to that, it's going to weaken the chemical bonds between the 2 small parts. And then what happens is the substrate then breaks down into its smaller components in order for the body to then digest and to use, okay? So if this was, for example, like a protein, it's going to break down into an amino acid, right? So different enzymes work on different types of molecules. So enzymes have equivalent molecules that they are best functioning for. So for example, amylases break down carbohydrates into monosaccharides. Proteases will break down proteins into amino acids, and lipases break down lipids into fatty acids and glycerol, right? So there's the amylase, there's your starch, and then it breaks it down into these little kind of mono and disaccharides. there's your protein, and the protease breaks it down into these little peptide chains, which then get later on broken down by peptidase into amino acids, and then lipases, which are these, the enzymes that break down lipids into the soluble fatty acids and glycerol molecules. You can see the ASE is kind of like an indicator that it's an enzyme, and usually they're named after the material that they're going to break down, okay? Enzymes also have a specific pH requirement. In other words, they have a certain level of acidity for them to really function and to function well. Okay, so changing pH can then change the shape and the function of the protein, either activating or deactivating them. Okay, so here's an example, right? Here are two different types of enzymes, pepsin and trypsin. And pepsin is primarily found in the stomach, which has a pH of 2. And so when you sit around that pH level, it's going to activate, and it's going to be really active in breaking things down at that pH level. However, when you get out of that pH level, it's going to then cease to function, because the change in acidity is going to modify the structure of the enzyme, which then either activates it or deactivates it. Trypsin, on the other hand, functions in the small intestine, which has a pH of 7 to 8 and is more effective along this particular area. So if you chuck trypsin into the stomach, it's not going to work. And if you remove pepsin from the stomach into the intestine, it's also not going to work. Okay, let's start with the first component, which is the mouth, where food goes in, and the mouth is responsible for chewing and breaking down food into smaller pieces. Okay, and so what the mouth does, or the oral cavity does, is it breaks down the food in order to increase the surface area to volume ratio. Increased surface area to volume ratio is going to prepare it for chemical digestion later. And as the food is being chewed, there's your teeth in case you didn't know, right? Saliva is then secreted through the salivary gland, which then lubricates it, helping it to then pass through the GI later on the gastrointestinal tract, okay? In addition, the mouth also contains the enzyme amylase, which then breaks down starch into maltose, which is the reason why if you keep any sort of bread or anything like that in your mouth, after a while we actually do taste a bit of a sweetness to that particular bread, because the enzymes are starting to break it down and make it into simple sugars that your body can then detect as being sweet. Now, in terms of your teeth, here's basically the human dentition, right? Which is you got your molars, you got your premolars, your canines, which are the sharp stuff at the ends, and then you've got your incisors, right? Your incisors cut things up. So your incisors and your canine cut things up, and your premolars start to grind them down. Okay, there are your salivary glands, both underneath your tongue and then also in the back of your throat as well, just behind your nasal cavity. And then there's your teeth at the front there. Okay. It turns out dentition can be a very, very good indicator of diet. So you can tell what an animal eats based on its teeth structure and the ratio and the shape of the skull as well. Okay, so actually, humans, we're over here. We have molars, incisors, molars, premolars, incisors, and canines. If you look at the dentition of something like, for example, a carnivore, you're going to notice a lot of sharp and serrated teeth, and that's because the diet of canines and carnivores and things like that are primarily meat, and you're just kind of trying to scissor off the meat. And in fact, if you look at the skull structure as well, that narrow lower jaw actually means that the teeth are going to overlap like scissors and cut and slice into meat a lot better. The presence of large canines is for catching food and gripping onto them. And then there are very, very little molars and premolars that are flat for chewing. So, not very good chewing there. Herbivores, on the other hand, like horses and deer, usually have really large molars and premolars, because they're going to grind up that grass and grind up that, that plant material a lot, and it needs to constantly be working. And so they've got a different teeth structure. They barely have any canines and incisors, and they're really just relying on the back teeth there to do the grinding. And then on top of that, the skull is also a really good indicator, because that open jaw, what that's going to do is, as it shuts, it's going to close the teeth onto each other, allowing it to chew better, as opposed to this kind of slicing action of the carnivores. Okay. Omnivores, like humans, we're actually a little bit of both. So you can see there we've got both incisors and canines at the front to cut things up, and then also really big stubby molars to then chew them and crush them down as well. Okay, what happens after the food gets chewed? Well, it just goes down the esophagus. So the esophagus is a tube that's going to carry the food from the mouth into the stomach, right? And there, just at the top of the esophagus is a little flap called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is going to prevent food from entering into your trachea and going into your lungs. And that's a pretty important process. Otherwise, you choke, and it's often associated with the gag and the cough reflex. Okay, you have to excuse this the diagram because once it ends, it seems to go black on you. The esophagus here, it's going to move food down, right? That food is, we call it a bolus, right? It's going to get pushed down through muscular contractions in the esophagus, and it's going to contract and push food down the tube and into the stomach. And that process is called peristalsis. Peristalsis also happens in other organs as well, but it's basically muscular contractions that move food along the GI. Okay. It's peristalsis is also the reason why food can actually not just go down, it can go up as well. So, you know, if you had a little bit too much to eat and you go out on a nice day on the boat and you get out on the water and then you start feeling seasick, you're going to puke. And when you puke, that peristalsis process happens in reverse, and it's going to push all the food up and out into the ocean, making wonderful burley for all that fish. Okay. Here's the diagram of kind of how it kind of pushes itself down, which you can take a look. Okay, from there it goes into the stomach. Now the stomach is really important for vital digestion of foods, particularly proteins. The proteins are going to be broken down in the stomach, and the stomach is really good at breaking down proteins, okay? Stomach muscles are going to contract, which is also peristalsis, and churn the food, and the bolus is going to then turn into a liquid-like thing called chyme or chyme, whatever you want to call it. And along the way, the stomach is going to release gastric acid. Gastric acid is a kind of a mixture of goop, which is going to contain a whole bunch of really important stuff. Number one, it's going to contain the protein digesting enzymes and the proteases such as pepsin, right? It's also going to contain hydrochloric acid, and the hydrochloric acid is going to bring the pH level down to 2, right? Now, that serves a really important process for a few things, okay? You think that an acidic stomach is designed to burn the food away. It's actually not. The hydrochloric acid, which brings it down to a really acidic level, is going to actually kill the bacteria and other infections from the food. And it's going to then allow the enzyme to activate. Remember that we talked about how enzymes are very active around that particular tumor, pepsin in particular, at the pH of 2. And so that's what the hydrochloric acid is doing, okay? Now, to prevent it from going too low from the hydrochloric acid, the stomach also releases a little bit of bicarbonate, which is going to keep the pH at 2, right? And it's really important to keep it at 2 so that the enzymes have optimal function, right? In order to prevent the stomach from digesting itself as well, because remember, you got to remember the stomach is made of protein itself. The muscles, the connective tissue, all of that, that's protein. And so when you release all these enzymes into that little sack of, the stomach sac, you're going to want to protect the stomach itself from the enzymes that are going to eat the meat that's in the stomach, right? And so there's a layer of mucus that's going to line the stomach, and that mucus is really important to protect against the acid, right? The average digestion time of the stomach is about 4 hours, which, if you notice, often correlates with the average time between our meals. And so actually when the stomach is empty, it triggers the hunger kind of response within our brain, telling us, oh, you're getting hungry, and it starts to churn, and you hear the rumbling of the stomach, and you're going to want to eat your next meal, okay? Between the stomach and the small intestine is the pyloric sphincter, this thing here, right? And then what it's going to do is as the food passes through there, it's kind of like the point of no return. It's not going to go backwards anymore. Once it goes through there, you can't vomit the stuff out after it leaves the stomach. It's going to go in through your intestines, and the only way it's going to go out is through the other side, okay? There is also an esophageal sphincter at the top of the stomach, which is going to prevent food from, as it's being churned, from going back up the esophagus. This is kind of pretty important because what happens is the gastric juices and the stomach acid, you're not going to want that to go anywhere else other than the stomach, because when it leaves and it goes up the esophageal sphincter, through the esophageal sphincter, and up to the esophagus, it's going to give you heartburn. And so heartburn is not a condition of the heart, it's a condition of the stomach and the esophagus, where you get this burning sensation in your heart because your stomach acid has actually leaked out of your esophageal sphincter and into your esophagus, burning your esophagus along the way. And usually that's a condition because you eat food that are too acidic or something like that, or you have an issue with your sphincter allowing it to function well, okay? Here's a diagram of how that chyme that chyme kind of gets churned by the stomach, and that's how that works, okay? Okay, after the stomach, you move into the small intestine. So the stomach digests a lot of the proteins. Well, the small intestine is also responsible for a little bit of digestion, but the majority of it is actually also responsible for absorption, collecting up all of the now broken down parts. So it's continued digestion, and the majority of the absorption of the nutrients occurs in the small intestine, okay? It's also the longest component of the GI, and it is about 7 meters long and about 3 centimeters in diameter. And usually it takes about also another 4 hours for the food to make its way through the small intestine as well. Okay, the small intestine has 3 particular sections. The first one, the J section here, that's the duodenum. The duodenum is the first section, and it's going to receive the chyme from the stomach and bringing the pH back up and continue to do that digestion. There's a little kink here, and after the little kink in the duodenum, you get the jejunum and the ileum. Okay, the jejunum is the midsection, and it's going to be primarily responsible for the absorption of nutrients from the food that you've just digested, and it's probably the kind of the longest part of the small intestine. And then the ileum is the final section that's going to absorb any vitamins and bile acids at the end as well. Okay. So the duodenum, right? So once you kind of leave the stomach, you get into the duodenum. It's about 20 centimeters in length, and what it's going to do is it's going to receive that chyme. And remember, that chyme is going to have a pH of about 2 because of the stomach. And so the duodenum is going to release more bicarbonates from the glands and the pancreas, which is going to then neutralize it and bring the pH back up to 7, which is going to allow other enzymes to then break it down, like, for example, trypsin, right? The digestion of lipids is going to also happen in here, and also proteins and a little bit of carbs, okay? And this is where a lot of the accessory organs come into play, okay? So, for example, digestion of lipids and fats require you to release an emulsifier that's going to break up the fat and the oils, right? Kind of like soap, right? How soap breaks up oils when we wash dishes, right? The liver makes a material called bile, and bile is an emulsifier. It's going to break up the fats into smaller parts, which can then be digested and absorbed later on. And so that bile gets produced by the liver, and then it gets stored in the gallbladder. So the liver's up here, next in front of the stomach. There's your liver. That's the biggest, pretty much the biggest or the heaviest organ in the body. And then it's going to produce that bile. It's going to send it to the gallbladder, and then that gallbladder is going to store it until it is then used by the duodenum for digestion and released into the duodenum, which then functions to break down the lipids. Okay. In addition, the pancreas, which is also kind of just next to the duodenum, is going to produce and secrete digestive enzymes, which are then going to break down that particular process even more. Okay, so a lot of really important digestion happening in both the stomach and the duodenum. In fact, the main parts of digestion. After that, so the jejunum, the 2.5 meters, is about 2.5 meters long, responsible for the absorption of the products of digestion from the GI into the bloodstream. So, now most of your stuff is going to be in a liquid form. Most of it's going to be broken down into little small bits and pieces, and it's ready to be absorbed into the bloodstream to provide nutrients for the rest of the body. And so your jejunum contains lots and lots of these circular folds and these little finger-like projections on the surface of the small intestine called the villi or the microvilli. Okay, so there's what it looks like, right? So there's your surface, and then you got your villi, and then each villi can be broken down into microvilli, and there's one cell containing many, many microvilli. Okay, the microvilli and the villi are designed to maximize surface area. Your small intestine is going to want to absorb as much as possible as quickly as possible. And so it's going to have lots and lots of these thousands and, hundreds of thousands and millions of these projections that is going to allow the amino acids, the glucose and the monosaccharides and the lipids to then be absorbed through the cells of the small intestine and then into the bloodstream on the other side of the epithelium. Okay. After the jejunum is the ileum, which is the final section, which, is actually longer than the jejunum, 3 meters long. And it also contains villi and microvilli, but they mainly absorb other things like vitamin B12 and bile acids, as well as the remaining nutrients. Okay. The ileum also joins together with the cecum of the large intestine, which we will look at next. After all of the nutrients is now absorbed, you have left the water, okay? And so the large intestine is going to absorb water from digestion, okay? It is about 2.5 meters long and about 5 to 8 centimeters in diameter. So it's considerably larger. So it's larger than the small intestine in diameter, not length. And so that's why they call it the large intestine. And check this out. The digestion time for the large intestine is 14 to 16 hours, right? So that is a considerable length of time, right? And so the food traveling through the large intestine gets all of that water removed from it. And it contains a series of different components, the ascending and descending colon and so forth, all kind of really doing this similar thing, right? So the first thing that happens is the pouch, right? So as it moves from the small intestine into this part here, it gets into the cecum, and the cecum has the appendix attached to it, right? And so it's going to receive a lot of that through a valve, and then what happens is the food then moves up the ascending colon, through the transverse colon, and then down the descending colon. It makes a lot of sense, right? Ascending meaning up, transverse meaning across, and then descending meaning down, okay? And so it goes up, around, and down, back around the other side of your body. And then all along the way, it's going to absorb all of that water. And once all that water gets absorbed, it's going to move into the rectum, and the rectum is this large storage component where it's just going to store your feces, right? So now all the water is removed, it's brown, it's disgusting, and it's ready to be pooped out. And so it's going to get stored in your rectum until your body is ready to release it, or until you are ready to release it, and then it's going to exit the GI via the anus, okay? Now, the anus contains a row of muscles called the anal sphincter, and that row of muscle is what basically makes up the anus, and that's going to remove the feces from the body, okay? Now, on top of that, you also have an additional piece of muscle, which is called the puborectalis muscle, which is a sling, right? And the puborectalis sling is also, as it contracts, is going to actually pull against the rectum and the anus, allowing you to actually hold your poop in. So very fascinating thing that I learned not too long ago when setting this up. But that's essentially how you hold your poop in. The combination of your anal sphincter and the puborectalis muscle sling that's attached to your pelvis, right? Pretty remarkable, okay? You also have an appendix that doesn't really do a whole lot, but scientists reckon that it contains a bit of a store of backup bacteria, because along the way you got a lot of beneficial bacteria that's going to be there, breaking down some of that food for you and allowing you to get most of the nutrients out of it. You can also thank the bacteria, because the bacteria in your gut also produce a lot of gas, and that's what makes you fart, because actually the bacteria that you are housing is what makes you fart. Your cells don't fart, right? Okay, now a bit of a look at the mammal systems, right? So mammals all exhibit variations in their digestive system depending on their diet. So we looked at how dentition affects diet. Well, diet also can also be reflected in the way that the digestive system is arranged. So in general, right, proteins and meat are actually quicker to digest. They take a lot less time than plant material. And so carnivores often have much more simple digestive tracts compared to herbivores, which are more larger and complex, right? So here's, for example, the digestive system of a dog. And you can see there, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, cecum, large intestine, pretty straightforward. Actually pretty shorter than a human's, right? Not just because dogs are smaller, but also because proportionally shorter as well. On the other hand, a cow, they say the cows actually have 3 stomachs. They don't have 3 stomachs. They have 3 compartments of the one stomach, which often gets confused for 3 different stomachs. And you can see there, very complicated, very, long, large intestine and a long, small intestine with a very large cecum and a very, very 3 compartment stomach, right? And then humans, we're omnivores, so we're somewhere in between, okay? And so that extensive stomach for the cow allows them to digest plant material even better, storing lots and lots of bacteria in their gut reserves, and then also in the small and large intestines as well. Now, in particular, though, actually, we're going to hone in on the herbivores, because they're really fascinating in the way they digest food. Herbivores are not naturally good at digesting plant material, so they actually need a bit of assistance. And so the reason for that is because a lot of plant material contains cellulose, which is a type of complex sugar, and those cellulose contains lots and lots of difficult sheets of glucose, which are really hard to break up. And a lot of animals don't actually have the enzyme cellulase, which are actually capable of breaking down these particular cellulose, right? And so they actually have to rely on bacteria in their gut to do that. And that digestion of plant material using all the assistance of bacteria, that's called fermentation, right? And there are basically two types of gut fermentation. Animals can either be what we call, herbivores can either be what we call hindgut fermenters or foregut fermenters, right? Hindgut fermenters are, there's a spelling mistake there. Hindgut fermenters occurs in the cecum, which happens after the small intestine, right? In other words, the main digestion happens after the small intestine, and so rabbits, horses, wombats, koalas are hindgut fermenters. The other type is the foregut fermenters. Foregut fermenters are when the fermentation happens in the stomach, and therefore the stomach is much more sophisticated and well developed, okay? So a lot of ruminants, such as cows, sheep, camels, and things like that, they are foregut fermenters, and a lot of that digestion happens before the small intestine, okay? Now, there is actually advantages and disadvantages to both, okay? So, for example, right, a lot of your foregut fermenters, the advantage is that because digestion happens in the stomach, a lot of the absorption of nutrients can happen in the small intestine, and it will absorb all of it in one go. And that's a real advantage, right? Because what that means is that you digest the food, you absorb the food. Great. Now, on the other hand, the hindgut fermenters, though, like rabbits, horses, and things like that, because the digestion happens after the small intestine, the disadvantage is that they don't absorb the nutrients as well. So what happens is the food's going to go through the first time, it's going to pass through the small intestine. Not much of it's going to get absorbed. It gets to the large intestine, which is where the cecum is, and then all of the digestion happens there, but then it gets all pooped out. So you got this really nutrient-rich poop which has just been digested. So what actually a lot of hindgut fermenters have to do is they actually have to sometimes eat their food twice. They eat the food the first time, digest it, and then they poop it out into this kind of rawish material. And what they would do is they'll actually eat it again. So they'll eat the poop twice, and then the second time the poop goes through, it's going to pass through the small intestine, and then it's going to get digested the second time, and all of those nutrients in the poop that got pooped out the first time is going to get absorbed properly the second time. So you might notice things like your rabbit eating its poop twice, or eating its poop, after it's eaten the food. And that's actually a healthy thing to do. You might see elephants kind of, sticking their trunks into poop and eating that poop, because what it's doing is collecting a lot of that nutrients, or collecting a lot of the beneficial bacteria back into the body. On the other hand, you'll never see a cow eat its poop twice, because cows don't need to do that. They do it once, they digest it really well, and then they then pass it all through. Now, the problem with cows, though, is that they can't eat any sort of low quality food. So it's actually not good for cows to eat materials that are too high in fiber, and it presents a bit of an issue. And what generally happens is if cows eat low quality food, they can't actually digest it really well, and they can't pass it through their system really well. On the other hand, cows also can't eat high protein rich food either, because of the way that the bacteria is stored in their stomach. What happens is if you give them too much protein rich food, then the stomachs get really bloated. The bacteria release a lot of gas, and then the stomach kind of just gets really bloated, and the cow dies because of it. And it's a very, very sad thing for a cow to die from a bloated stomach. But you will notice that sometimes you'll see cows and things like that, or sheep that are dead on the side of the road, and they've got these really huge stomach. And the reason why they're super bloated is because all the bacteria in the gut is still digesting the food, even though the animal's dead, and that creates a lot of gas, making it really bloated. All right, that's it from me for the digestive system. I'll see you guys in the next video when we look at the endocrine and the excretory. See ya.